Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Conor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our very special guest this week, none other than Dan Wootton, the man behind Dan Wootton Outspoken, a new podcast on YouTube, and be sure to subscribe to that. Now, we should be probably saying in advance, Dan, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
That we're recording this on Monday, the 5th of August, and we saw mass civil unrest over the weekend in response to a second-generation Rwandan immigrant murdering 3 girls in Southport, and Keir Starmer's fairly pugnacious, in fact, cloth-eared response to popular outrage by focusing exclusively on the so-called far right and ignoring the antics of imported foreign subcultures. Do you think that Starmer has effectively declared war on the host population of Britain?
I mean, yes, I do. I think what was very shocking is that he had an opportunity yesterday, as you say, we're recording this Monday, so on Sunday, to see the impact of his original press conference. I actually have a lot to say about that press conference because I don't think you can solely blame this on Starmer. He's obviously Prime Minister, but one of my jobs is obviously to be very critical of the media and the mainstream media. And not one journalist at his press conference on Thursday asked one question about the Southport massacre. Every question in that press conference, remember, this is the first time he had faced the press since those 3 girls were stabbed to death. And every single one of those questions was about either misinformation, Nigel Farage, the far right, Tommy Robinson. So this is a conspiracy between the establishment, the political establishment, and the mainstream media. So I think that's got to be pointed out. But yesterday he had an opportunity to have seen the impact of his words and to have pulled back in some way, but he didn't. He doubled down. And we know that this is because he is a very ideological man who effectively hid himself from the public as opposition leader. And I always said that when people tried to say, oh, no, Starmer's really moderate. I knew that was absolute rubbish. You know, he is a hard left guy. Believe what he said. You know, Owen Jones got it wrong, actually, when it comes to Starmer. He is a hard left guy, and he had an opportunity to pull back. So I do feel like he has declared war, and it's going to be really worrying to see where this hits.
It really is, and it's worth saying as well that you're right, when people make these distinctions between certain aspects of the left, what they tend to miss is that there's a fundamentally shared ideological mission at work. The only difference that you get is there's a sort of variability with how outspoken certain people are. So that you get the sort of intelligent, strategic left people like Keir Starmer who keep their cards quite close to their chest, and their equivalents in the US would be people like Nancy Pelosi and David Axelrod, these types of figures. Whereas then you get the kind of the rabid Antifa-style left that can't contain itself. But there's a sort of pincer movement that goes on between these groups. They really do share a mission. Which aspects of Starmer's what is it in particular about Starmer's ideological mission that troubles you?
Well, I think the thing that is by far the most chilling is that his solution to this problem is to censor debate. Now, clearly that's something that we all care a lot about here, and it's something that particularly impacts us. But it impacts everyone. I mean, when your solution to a problem is to shut down discussion about the problem, I mean, that's authoritarian. And I do not rule out, and I really mean this, I do not rule out a time. I mean, remember, we're only 4 weeks into this government. Where are we going to be in 4 years? Are social media platforms like Elon Musk's X actually going to be allowed to operate in the UK? I honestly think we are heading into that level of authoritarianism, and that's really scary.
And outlets like Dan Wootton's Outspoken, the NCF, and of course Lotus as well, Conor.
Well, the infrastructure that, unfortunately, the Conservative Party handed to them, the Online Safety Bill, appointing Ofcom, Blairite institution, that has caused you particularly a lot of trouble for
the communists, as I call them.
Exactly, with warranted reason. He's just handed them jurisdiction now to the Labour Party, the successors, over the internet to police bias, police misinformation, arbitrarily hit with a cudgel any dissenter that they don't like. We don't know what form that could take. And we know the willingness of this, not just because Starmer said he will go after anyone inciting the riots online, very flexible definition of that there, but as we spoke in our last episode, Harrison, about the Parnell Square stabbings, the response from former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was to forward a hate speech bill to combat misinformation and the far right. It's never the perpetrators of the attack. It's never the government policy that imported said perpetrators who per capita commit a disproportionate amount of violent crime against the host population. Those things are never at fault. It's always the people like you and me that are pointing out the problem.
Oh, yeah. Disinformation caused these riots, if you are to believe the political establishment. But I also think we should point out some of this really scary dystopian talk is not only coming from the left. I mean, Miriam Cates, who is someone who probably most viewers think is very sound and good on lots of social issues.
Yes.
However, she wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph talking about the need to censor online. The Sun newspaper, where I used to be executive editor, their lead editorial, the day after these riots broke out, was to say that social media companies should be cracked down upon, which effectively means free speech should be cracked down upon. Now, remember, there's lots of motivation within the mainstream media, too, to go at social media. I mean, when I see newspapers like The Guardian and the Daily Mirror saying to Starmer at the press conference, what can be done? What can be done? What can you do to shut down these social media companies? How can they be punished? Number one, I think, my goodness, the irony of that, given some of the behaviour by, for example, the Daily Mirror and the Guardian when it comes to phone hacking, and both of those newspapers continued. No one was suggesting they should be shut down as a result of their illegal behaviour. That's the first thing. But the second thing is there is a commercial motivation for people like that. So I was disappointed in Miriam Cates, much more expected it from the likes of Tobias Ellwood, you know, the Tory wits. But anyone who looks at this problem and thinks that censorship is the answer, you are misdiagnosing what's going on.
On Ellwood specifically, before I hand back to Harrison, he was a reserve member of the 77th Brigade who made it their mission to gaslight and monitor critics of lockdown like Julian Hartley-Brewer and Peter Hitchens, who were saying this might not be necessary for the healthy population. And at the same time, all the newspapers were taking money, as Laura Dodsworth has documented, to run round-the-clock Project Fear ads, meaning they had a profit incentive to speak the state line. And the profit incentive is making itself manifest here, because if people are seeking their often more immediate, more accurate news on free speech platforms like Twitter, then it eats into their bottom line and it eats into their ability to control the narrative. So, of course, they have the perverse incentive to lobby the government to censor these people.
Yeah. And actually, a lot of politicians just go along with it, including a lot of conservative politicians who are lobbied by newspaper editors. And I actually think conservative politicians are not catching up to the revolution that's happening in the media fast enough, and more fool them, I would argue. Whereas if you look at Reform UK, I would argue that's a party that realises they're never going to get fair treatment from the mainstream media. But when it comes to a story like this, they are utilising X. That's where they're putting out their public messaging. That's where they put out their letters directly. We've seen Farage today call for Parliament to be recalled, but we've also seen very strong statements from the likes of their new chairman, Zia Youssef, Richard Tice.
Richard Tice has been fantastic this week.
Lee Anderson, Rupert Lowe. And actually, I think all of those guys are much more sensible because they're realising we can just cut out the MSM now. We're going directly to the people here and we're doing it on a free speech platform like X. So, yeah, it's no surprise to me that the solution is censorship.
In his 2015 book, The Strange Death of Europe, Douglas Murray did us all an immense service by drawing a really, really clarifying distinction, which is obviously quite obvious when you think about it, but he has this gift of clarity about him, between primary problems and secondary problems. And while I deplore all violence and all acts of criminal damage, I refuse to draw a moral equivalence between the presence of vindictive colonizers in our country who have no ancestral connection to Britain, who are completely indifferent, if not hostile, to the interests of the host population, and those of us who resent their presence here. And do you think that politicians have done a good enough job? And I mean on our side of things, of making that distinction clear? Because obviously you want the disavowals of violence and criminal damage to take place. This is not the way, although of course it was the elites who kind of ripped up the social contract in the first place. I mean, if people can't resort to expressing their views via the ballot box and they're consistently ignored on that score, they have very little else at their disposal. And this has become a lightning rod for a whole powder keg of grievances that have been built up over the last 25 years or so. But do you think that distinction between it's being well enough made by our side about separating the legitimacy of the motives and the wrongness of the actions?
Well, no, I don't. But I think there's actually so much irony in all of this, because if you look at my public statements, right, dating right back to 2020, I would argue that I've been one of the most consistent people when it comes to violence against the police. Totally the opposite to the left, which we know. So I deplored every Black Lives Matter march where police were injured and criminal damage took place. I've deplored every Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, all of them. All of the pro-Hamas marches, the violence against the police at Manchester Airport, the violence against the police at Rochdale Police Station, and, yes, now the violence... Hare Hills was another one, and now the violence against police over this crisis. I am absolutely on the side of police by consent when it comes to the need for there to be absolutely no violence against the police. But I'm sorry, there has been absolutely no consistency on that front from leftists, either commentators, broadcasters, politicians. They have excused violence whenever it suits their ideology, and we have seen it time and again. Now, obviously, I think the most egregious example of that is Slippery Starmer and Angela Rayner, who literally watched the violence against the police during the Black Lives Matter protests. I will never forget it. I was broadcasting at Talk Radio at that time, and Talk Radio really was a haven within the mainstream media at that point for being one of the only organizations within the mainstream media to call out Black Lives Matter. Everyone else went along with this narrative, including all the main newspapers, mostly peaceful protests. Let's ignore the violence. Let's go along with this George Floyd
racial reckoning
stuff. Yeah, 100%, because they were, they were all absolutely terrified. Now, of course, at that point, GB News didn't exist, and I wasn't there at that point. But at Talk Radio, we absolutely called it out, and we took huge amount of flack for doing so. But I was disgusted by those scenes. What did Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner do the Monday after those despicable scenes? They literally took the knee. I mean, they literally took the knee. Yeah. So they did not condemn the violence at all. And we know there's been two-tier policing. I mean, on my show last week, I contrasted the clips of Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, her language and tone after the Hare Hills riots, which involved the Muslim community and the Roma community, compared to her tone after the start of the riots in Southport. It was just completely different. And so we can see them. We know what they've done. But I will stress, I am consistent when it comes to violence against the police. I think it's completely unacceptable. But we all know that the elites and the media are not consistent.
Indeed, going back to the question of motives again, and also just to put a fine point on your completely correct two-tier policing observation. I actually read a report in the BBC 5 days after those riots in Hare Hills, and only 17 people were arrested. Yet in Whitehall on Wednesday last week, where in fact a lot of what people were doing was actually pretty. Obviously, there were people hurling things, bricks at police, hurling bottles at police, and throwing beer at police horses. You get those people. But 111 people were arrested, and the police, when the far right are in town, turned up with full riot gear. Whereas in Hare Hills, obviously, they were running with their tails between their legs.
But we've seen it with the Tommy Robinson marches. We've seen it with the. Even the Euros,
yes.
This absolute desire to shut down London by Sadiq Khan on the night of the Euros finals, when he had not done anything of the sort for all of the pro-Hamas marches. But the thing for me is that we see this inconsistency. It's very clear. It's very obvious. But we also see, and I actually hate the term disinformation and misinformation. I won't use it because we know it's now been weaponized against our side of the argument constantly. So I'll just call it what it is, lies. And we see these lies being picked up by the mainstream media. So I'll give you the example of Southport and what happened during that first so-called riot, that first
the day after, yeah.
All of the information coming from the mainstream politicians and the mainstream media was that angry people from outside of the community, far-right agitators, had been brought in, had been shipped in to hijack the grief going on in Southport. Now, that simply wasn't backed up by the facts. The majority of the people who were arrested were locals from Southport. So, again, these things are just said, and because they're repeated by politicians and then guzzled up and regurgitated by the mainstream media, they become facts. And it's really, really disturbing because the thing is, I didn't know whether that was true or not initially.
Yes.
And maybe there were some groups that came in from outside the community, but the fact that the people arrested were locals actually suggests to me that the people who were very angry were the locals. And if you look at the heckling of Slippery Starmer, which was immediately forgotten by the mainstream media, just move on. I mean, can you imagine if Boris Johnson had been heckled in that manner after a tragedy? It would be leading every mainstream news bulletin for days, right? In this case, it was forgotten. They were just embarrassed about it. But I listened very carefully to what the people were saying to Starmer, and it was clear that they were locals who were angry about what had happened. I mean, one of the women who was heckling actually said that her friend's 9-year-old daughter had been stabbed. Now, we don't know if that was one of the victims who'd been fatally stabbed or one of the victims who was injured, who's in hospital. But the point is, that's a local who is absolutely horrified about what's just happened in their community.
It's also darkly comical that the media going along with this idea that disinformation was the cause of that backlash in Southport, that you need some Tommy Robinson tweets and some Andy No tweets to radicalize you, as if the mass slaughter of children in your own community followed by a complete information vacuum isn't radicalizing enough.
Not just an information vacuum. Remember, Keir Starmer did not feel the need to get up and give a press conference after the stabbings.
Yes.
It was only after the retaliation to the stabbings.
Totally.
In response to BLM, he did a down-the-phone video saying, I sympathise with everyone around the world that's seen the horrific scenes of George Floyd. Nothing like that after the South.
And in fact, during the press conference, and I actually view this as gaslighting, during the press conference he actually said, this is not the time to discuss what happened. You're irresponsible effectively if you do it, because what you're doing is you're hijacking the grief of the people in Southport. Well, okay, when are we going to have that conversation, Keir? Because you know what happens. Someone is charged, and this happens every time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can't talk about it immediately because you're accused of hijacking someone's grief. Then someone is charged and you say, oh, well, you've got to let the judicial system play out because the UK has what I believe ridiculous laws where you cannot talk about the specifics of any crime once a perpetrator has been charged, no matter how guilty they are, no matter how serious their malice was or how proven it was. And then what happens? Well, by the time it gets to court, you're 18 months on.
Everyone's forgotten.
Everyone's forgotten. Everyone's moved on.
It happened with David Amos.
Or the bombing outside the Liverpool maternity hospital, which could have killed hundreds.
Yes. And the only exception to that general rule, Dan, of course, is when you can find some socially approved way of making it politically legitimate. So there were no shortage of pieces about how Thomas Mehr, when he murdered Joe Cox, had been radicalised by the fire. Oh, he said Britain first. You're allowed to speculate in that direction. And indeed, when someone like David Amos is slaughtered by, I believe, a Somali chap in
Ali Harbi Ali
in his own surgery in his constituency, you were allowed to politicise the affair if you were doing it in order to try and shore up the online safety bill, which was currently being debated at the time. And there was even this grotesquely sentimental idea that should be renamed David's Law. And
that was by Marc Francois.
Marc Francois said that.
It's really disappointing. And or Mike Freer, literally last year, as Parliament is sitting in session, and Sir Lindsay Hoyle's petrified of another MP being a victim of an Islamist attack like David Amos. Mike Freer's office is firebombed on Christmas Eve, I believe it was, and he goes on GB News and Talk TV, and when he's asked about it, he's saying, we can't demonise an entire community.
Yes.
We couldn't possibly blame this. He actually even had the temerity to suggest we don't know the real motivation of David Amos's murder. after multiple Islamist groups in a very Jewish area, which is Finchley and Golders Green, had harassed him out of office over the Palestine issue.
And David Amos, I mean, that was one of the...
You mean Mike Freer there, don't you?
Yes.
Not David Amos.
No,
You said
but
David Amos.
when he was asked about what
David
we saw what
Amos.
happened with David Amos by Julia Hartley-Brewer, he said, well, we don't know what motivated David Amos.
I'm sorry.
But I was just going to say with David Amos, I mean, it was one of the most intellectually dishonest response to an act of terrorism, and it was, again, down to intellectuals like Douglas Murray to actually be able to point this out. It's nothing to do with social media, absolutely nothing to do with it. Now, of course, when it comes to being told that we cannot discuss these crimes because of Islamophobia, this is another really interesting one for me, because I come at this from a different point of view, probably from both of you, because as a gay man, I know that the majority of Muslims in this country do not believe that I have a right to exist legally. And, that's according to very accurate polling, by the way.
Trevor Phillips polling.
Which is not done very often, I mean, for obvious reasons.
And as well, just to put a fine point on that, it's that attitude is, in fact, in many cases, more prevalent among younger Muslims. And so the idea that this is going to demographics are going to sort this out over time is not true.
And so I say that as a gay man. Now, what about women?
Yeah.
I mean, if you are a woman, I think you have a massive understandable right to be very concerned about the spread of Islam, Sharia law through the back door in the UK. So does that make us Islamophobic for talking about this? What I'm concerned about a religious ideology that doesn't want me to exist. If you're a woman, you're concerned about a religious ideology that literally wants you back at home covered up.
As a Christian, I'm concerned I'll be beheaded for apostasy, frankly. Like, I don't want my friends to be attacked like this. I don't want my wife put in a bin bag. I don't want to be attacked as an Englishman who doesn't share the convictions.
Of course. So actually, when people talk about Islamophobia now, I dismiss it, really. I just dismiss it. I don't think that it's at all accurate or relevant, because if I have concerns about a religion which is trying to take hold in my country that doesn't want me to be able to exist, I'm Islamophobic. Well, it's meaningless. That is a meaningless term. You can try and call me that if you want. I don't care anymore, because I do have concerns, and I'm not afraid to speak about those concerns. And the fact that the left are, again, it's just this rank hypocrisy, given that this is the most woke group of society who claims that they care about the rights of LGBT people and women, but they don't really, do they? Because if they did, why would they be so supportive of Islam?
Well, they're now creating specific laws that criminalise Islamophobia, as Peter has given an excellent monologue on, as a perception of racism or kind of racism,
or perceived Muslim.
Yes, so
which is very vague and inflationary way of pinpointing what you're trying to prosecute. If I say, for example, that I don't like being surrounded by people wearing the burqa in my community, or if I complain about grooming gangs, I mean, does that qualify under perceived Muslimness as a potential offence?
Of course, totally, and all of that I agree with. But I just think with me, it's so clear and visceral, isn't it? It's like, why on earth would I not be against a religion that does not want me to be able to exist in my own country? And that is a fact. There's no there's no pussyfooting around this. It is an absolute fact. They do not want me to be able to exist and live the life that I've chosen to live.
On that, then, I mean, I would provide a bit of pushback against the police, and that is, so to preface all of this with, no one should be going to these riots and committing criminal and property damage. It's both imprudent and wrong. That aside, the reason they're doing this is, I think, because the hypocrisy has been made so apparent on various videos, on tweets, on media, time and time again, that now the police look like the enforcement arm of the regime. For example, when Rachel Reeves says we don't have the money to ensure that pensioners have winter heating bills anymore, so you're just going to have to sacrifice it, and then Starmer comes out and said, £28 million dedicated on the spot to round-the-clock protection for mosques. When the police turn around and say, oh, hand in all of your weapons, Muslim Defence League, Muslim-specific patrol, to the local mosque as if it's some kind of armory, and then
Which we
scapegoat
saw over the weekend on video.
and scapegoat about the obsolete EDL, which no longer exists. And as you quipped before the podcast, they wouldn't turn around to them and say, "Drop off your bats and bricks at Tommy's house, boys." They would never do that. It's so manifestly apparent that the Palestine marchers shot fireworks at police horses, were chanting for intifada and jihad. Meanwhile, the very peaceful St George's Day gathering, they kettled them in, they drove police horses at children, they've started fights with the protesters rather than the other way around. And so I am not shocked that tensions have got to this point, and that the frontline police officers, when the College of Policing has been putting out so much anti-white, anti-English rhetoric time and time again, when Prevent have demonised the far right rather than obscuring the disproportionate per capita threat of Muslims in Britain, I'm not shocked that lots of British patriots have turned around and gone, well, you're not protecting us. You're actually only applying the law to the English because the English accept police by consent, and you're making a protectorate group of these foreign interlopers who are existing in my community at my expense, whether in illegal migrant hotels or in social housing. I'm not surprised that the ire has been directed at the police.
Well, no, and again, I would also add the irresponsibility of the media in this too, because if you look at the Muslim Defence League, where are the investigations into that? Where are the calls to ban that organisation? And there was literally footage this weekend of Sly News broadcasting live with Muslim men behind them.
It was Middlesbrough, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the blades were massive. These were huge blades. And the moment that they came on camera, the Sly News reporter tried to get out of shot, didn't even acknowledge that there was another group that was taking part. Now, as the weekend went on, it was quite fascinating to see, because actually the BBC and ITV News were forced to acknowledge this. I mean, they didn't particularly want to, but they did have to report that a lot of the violence was coming from this rival Muslim group. But it shows you, doesn't it, they will only report that when they absolutely have to.
They said through gritted teeth that Asian men, I mean, it wasn't roving gangs of Sikhs or Japanese businessmen, had charged a police line in Bolton. And then one of the lines that the clip is up on my Twitter was, there were cries of Allahu Akbar, which people were disappointed by. And it's like, that's so disappointing that you decided to chant the exact reason that you're out on the streets scrapping with police.
And I mean, there's very limited honesty from the mainstream media. I mean, I've seen a little bit of honest reporting today from the Daily Telegraph, who are usually the best on this. But really, the problem is now, and this is why they want to censor social media, isn't it? We see it. The people see it. We saw with our own eyes what was going on. Now, that doesn't mean any of us are excusing some of the appalling behaviour from whatever you want to call them, thugs.
Don't burn down a migrant hotel.
No,
it's
rather appalling.
It endangers people's life, even if they are the totem of the immiseration of the native English tax-paying population. Don't commit criminal damage that could land you in prison for decades.
No, and also, it doesn't help the cause. It doesn't help your argument on any level. But the fact is, we have seen with our own eyes over the weekend that there's been dishonest reporting on the mainstream.
So we've seen countless examples then of the host population's completely justified grievances being policed in a much more heavy-handed manner than any of the sort of spurious grievances wheeled out by these sorts of tribal minority subcultures, which are inevitably treated with kids' gloves. And this is what I'm going to ask you now, Dan. This complaint about two-tiers policing predates the Labour government, of course, because, frankly, the existence of an all-pervasive race taboo in our society, Eric Kaufman talks about this in his new book, it's been there for a while. And as such, whenever community tensions erupt in certain places, it's precisely as Connor says, it's because the host population consents to being policed that you actually are able, whenever they rise up in this fashion, the police feel very, very confident in enforcing the law without fear or favour. When we're talking about certain minority grievances, there's a concern that the police act more as diplomats, referees between competing stakeholders than they do as enforcers of the law without fear or favour. Now, that's been in place for a while. it's going to get worse with Labour, I would suggest, precisely because Labour relies upon precisely these kinds of communities as a sort of political clientele class in the way that the Conservatives never did. So is this two-tier policing going to get worse over the next 5 years or so?
I think it clearly will get worse. I would very strongly say that, of course, no minority group should feel persecuted in any way. All I am asking for is fair policing across all groups. That's the point. All groups have to be policed in the same way. And so if you are rioting and you are white or a member of a prescribed terrorist organization, you should be treated harshly. But likewise, you should if you are a member of the Muslim Defence League or a member of Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or Insulate Britain, which I have been calling for years eco-terrorists. And think how long it took the Conservative government to catch up with the types of terror that they were causing, which is actually far more egregious than a lot of the other stuff that has gone on this weekend, because those people are actually talking about destroying critical infrastructure, which grinds the country to a halt. And by the way, directly causes deaths because you are blocking transport methods for ambulances, for example. So not all of this comes down to ethnicity or religion either, because who are these Just Stop Oil protesters?
Predominantly white middle class.
Yeah, white middle class people. I am calling for them to be absolutely treated in the same way. Do you see what I mean? So that's why it's very, very wrong to accuse someone like me of making calls about two-tier policing based on race or based on religion. It's not. I just want a level playing field.
I do too, but the problem with that is that, so we have seen increasingly some of these eco-terrorists actually have been being put away. There was that.
Yeah, it's just started.
It just started, and
after a lot of sympathy from a lot of judges, by the way, who
Indeed.
literally let them free.
And you had those sort of very eccentric old age pensioners who sort of were smashing up copies of Magna Carta, and they were let out, I think, in Bristol within a matter of hours.
There's climate ISIS.
Yeah, can you imagine if Tommy Robinson started smashing some copies of the Magna Carta?
That's the point. And these are white middle class people.
Indeed, but what one difference you get, though, is that when you have, and I'm sure you agree with this, but when you have these sort of tribal subcultures existing within your society, they're in your society, but they're not in any meaningful sense of your society. Sure, there's a certain amount of ideological solidarity among these sort of white middle-class eco-terrorists, but it's nowhere near as combustible and nowhere near as strong as the sense of asabiah.
But I would say they are two separate arguments, though, because you've got an argument about two-tier policing, and my point is it doesn't matter in that case. It doesn't matter where you're from, what your background is. That's irrelevant to me when it comes to the way that the police should be enforcing the law. Then you have the other discussion, which obviously is being shut down, which is about a complete failure of multiculturalism, a complete lack of cultural assimilation, and also just, we are living the experiences of mass immigration, which the British population have time and again voted to curb in every general election for the last 15 years, not to mention the biggest democratic vote of them all, our decision to leave the EU. Much of that was about immigration. But all I would say is, to me, they are two separate conversations, because you have the conversation about two-tier policing, and then you have the conversation about why there is this anger.
I see, okay.
It's also not just a conversation about Islam, because as far as we are aware, the perpetrator of the Southport stabbings is not a Muslim.
No, of course.
The perpetrator of the concurrent Southend machete battles among second-generation urban youth is not. So it is a broader conversation about the unwillingness to apply the law to particular groups.
Exactly. But, and we have to be very careful about what we say, obviously, because this is a man where there is lots of contempt of court issues going on. So I won't talk specifically about Axel.
Yes.
But what I will say is there is much that we cannot report at the moment. And I've seen a lot. Now, I haven't been able to verify if it's true or not because we are not able to do so at this point.
It's still all speculation.
Yes. And I won't go into what it is, but there is a lot to suggest that there may be more, there may be a lot of issues in terms of the points that I was making in terms of multiculturalism and assimilation that relate to this case.
Yes.
But that will not be able to be discussed until after his trial.
Yes, of course.
And that could be 2 years away.
Yes. And to jump off the back of that, we did have certain Conservative ministers making noise about two-tier policing before. Lee Anderson, who I was a staunch defender of, the Conservative Party exiled for pointing out that Sadiq Khan's career-long history of defending Islamist terrorists, including one of the perpetrators of 9/11, might have something to do with his willingness to allow Islamists to protest every weekend and Wednesday on behalf of Hamas. Suella Braverman said that she feared for her own Jewish family members and was swiftly deposed from the Home Office. The reason I'm bringing this up is, so we've got another 4 and a bit years of the Labour Party. They're not going to do anything of this. They're dripping with contempt for the English working class, which they have put in this ideological pigpen as far right. The Conservative Party are undergoing a leadership battle at the moment. They're not willing to listen to critics inside the tent, as Calvin, Carl have learned from being kicked out. And also as Suella has learned because she's no longer running to be leader because her NatCon DC speech upset the Wets. You've been documenting both in dialogue with MPs on your former and current show, but also the ongoings, the internal machinations in the Tory party. Are you encouraged that the Conservatives are going to course correct and provide an opposition?
No, absolutely not. And I actually genuinely say that from a place of sorrow. I really hoped that after the election, the makeup of the Conservative Party was going to be such that actually there could be a reinvention, there could potentially be either a deal with Farage or a merge with Reform or something that would unite the right. But the problem is, and Patrick O'Flynn did really great analysis on this, when you look at who got back in, it's effectively One Nation Wets. And immediately, as the leadership contest has started, and of course, you know, the Conservative Party, who just have no idea about how to do this thing, have fixed it in a way where the majority of the debate over who's going to become leader is aimed at MPs, not members, because it's only once they get down to the final two that it goes to members. So what we've seen actually is people like Priti Patel, who's running, moderate their message, if anything, to try and appeal to One Nation Conservative MPs.
She only recently condemned Farage for that very message that you just mentioned.
This morning, So exactly, that because they feel like they have to appeal to the One Nation caucus, which is all about, well, we're going to destroy Farage, we're going to destroy Reform, and there's a way that we can get back into government in 5 years' time without a deal with Nigel and Reform. Well, look, 5 years is a long time in politics. I have a big issue with that, by the way. There is no way that the UK parliamentary term in this day and age should be 5 years. It's insane. I know people say that it brings stability, right, to government. It doesn't. If you look at any major Western democracy, it's 4 years max. In New Zealand, my home country, it's 3 years. Every 3 years, you have a new government. So, look, I know that's another conversation, but I think it's insane that we are stuck with Keir Starmer for 5 years, regardless of what he does. I think it's very anti-democratic. 5 years is too long. But the problem is that you're seeing this moderate message go out, and I'm just like, you're just completely irrelevant to this discussion. You know, Kemi Badenoch over the weekend, again, lying about leaving the ECHR. Let's just be honest about it. Oh, I might. They all say they might. It's like, no, that's done. So no, look, 5 years is a long time in politics. A lot of what happens is going to be determined, I believe, by Farage and how committed Nigel really is to building this movement. He says he's committed. I hope he's committed to it. But I've been very open about who I've supported because, again, I view myself as a modern independent journalist. who doesn't lie to my audience, because believe me, all of the people who you're being fed information from the MSM, they have their views. You know they have their views. They're just not honest with you about it. So I was very honest about the fact that I backed Boris Johnson, very honest about the fact that I backed Liz Truss. I did not support Rishi Sunak, but I gave him an opportunity to try and save the party. Once he was leader, he completely failed. And so at the last election, I did vote for Reform UK, which is not something that I necessarily would have thought that I would have done. Because in the first past the post system, I think it is very, very difficult for a minor party. However, I feel now like there is a strong chance Nigel Farage could be Prime Minister in 2029. I really believe that if you analyse all of the red wall type seats where Reform was second, I mean, come on, they only had a 5-week campaign with Farage. It's extraordinary. And so I feel like there is the possibility that the Tory party become a bit of an irrelevance. I guess it's probably going to be a final two. I don't know if you agree, but a final two of Kemi Badenoch versus Robert Jenrick. That seems to be where things are heading. Personally, I back Jenrick over Badenoch, but I still don't trust him. I mean, he was a Remainer and a Rishi Sunak guy who got into the Home Office, I think understood the fury of the British public about immigration and thought, well, my best hope here is to get out.
I called him
and
a recent convert to the blindingly obvious.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not against someone who is a recent convert. I mean, Liz Truss was a recent convert to Brexit, and she is a true believer now. So
I think it was Russell Kirk who famously said that everyone should rejoice when a prostitute renounces the error of her ways and comes to church, but don't give her access to the pulpit on the first week. And I think that
would be the risk of making Robert Jenrick leader.
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But look, for me, there are huge issues with Kemi Badenoch that people don't understand.
Elaborate on those, because they really don't.
Yeah. So what they see with Badenoch is, don't get me wrong, a very attractive and appealing social warrior who ticks every single box in terms of demography. You know, her story is incredible. The fact that she came to this country with £10 in her pocket and is such a success story in lots of ways. So I fully back her story, and I understand why that's an appealing idea for the Conservative Party to take on a left-wing Labour government. It's much more difficult to make accusations against Kemi Badenoch, a black immigrant. And actually, when it comes to social issues, she's brilliant. You know, she's brilliant on the trans issue, for example. She's brilliant on the war on woke. There's a lot of things that Kemi Badenoch has done really well.
To an extent, because she is very willing to turn around and say, my critics are straight white men, how dare they? Or ESG isn't achieving its goals, which is the problem. Or the main problem with trans isn't that it's a lie and it's mutilating children, it's specifically mutilating gay children, which is true, but you shouldn't.
Well, she always moderates the message, doesn't she? Yeah, because who was it that it was?
David Tennant told her to.
David Tennant, that's right. Yes, but as you rightly pointed out, and I was also furious about this, she immediately hit back with identity politics and made it about the fact that David Tennant was a white man. It's like, no, you're literally going against every single argument that you make, which is that we support you, Kemi, because of who you are, not because of the colour of your skin. And come on, the Conservative Party has proven time and again that it doesn't give a damn. Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak, that was very disappointing. But for me, the far bigger issue with Kemi Badenoch is that she is controlled, and she is controlled by the people who have just destroyed the Conservative Party. I mean, I highly recommend everyone looks at Nadine Dorries' book and tweets about this. But fundamentally, she is the chosen candidate of Michael Gove and Dougie Smith and CCHQ, who have destroyed this party. So why on earth would you put another puppet in to this role? No, that the party needs metaphorically to be blown up. Seriously, CCHQ has to start again. I mean, they are a corrupt organisation. The way that they choose candidates is corrupt. They actually despise their membership. They look down on their membership. I'm a proud supporter of the CDO, the Conservative Democratic Organisation, which wants to bring democracy back to the Conservative Party. The problem is, if Kemi Badenoch is the leader, that is not happening.
What do you think? What do they like about Kemi, these people?
I guess I think they like the points that I've made. I mean, she is a very appealing leader for all of the reasons that I've explained. To have a black woman who is socially conservative in some ways up against Labour, I get it. Like, that looks really good.
She's bulletproof to an extension.
Yeah.
But then you're also conceding to the optical rules laid down by your opponents in finding that attractive in the first place. And
100%, because that's not why I have supported in the past Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. I mean, I could not give a damn.
But do you think that's
about
all? Do you think that's
colour.
what I'm trying to understand is that people like Gove who in large part engineered this implosion of the Tory party in the first place. What is it particularly about
I mean, I'm not saying it's just because of that. I'm saying she's partly appealing for that, but also she did their dirty work. I mean, look at the WhatsApp exchange when she was literally doing all she could to get cabinet ministers and senior whips to turn on Boris Johnson in his hour of need. A decision that, by the way, I still and I criticised Boris for lots of things. I was very against his lockdown policies, against the Net Zero policies. However, I supported him because he was the democratically elected Prime Minister of the UK. And her lobbying to get Boris out, which was actually done via like gross sort of schoolyard bullying tactics of like removing people from WhatsApp groups and making threats. I mean, it was so wrong. And it was also a decision, let's be honest about it, that led to the biggest historic defeat in modern history for the Conservative Party. I mean, how can she not take responsibility for that? So I guess what I'm saying is that she will do their dirty work, and they know she will do their dirty work. She was very disappointing as a cabinet secretary. She immediately stopped the bonfire of the Brexit laws. So, I mean, I think she's appealing from the point of view of optically, and I think she's appealing for them because she is controlled by them. And you know, there's loads of dirty stuff that goes on. Like, there was this story that ran saying that Kemi Badenoch and Michael Gove had fallen out because he had a fling with one of her friends. Well, no one has ever found out the name of that apparent friend. And if you speak to senior people within the Conservative Party, many believe that was literally a lie that was put out via the Times newspaper to try and trick members into believing that Kemi Badenoch was no longer being controlled by Michael Gove.
Well, that's interesting because if it's the Times, Kemi recently had her shadow cabinet notes leaked by the Times to career assassinate Suella as being a sort of Pied Piper far-right candidate. And then she quote retweeted it saying, very disappointing, didn't address as to whether any of the claims themselves were or were not bad. And so it positioned Kemi to look like the sensible voice in the room telling uncomfortable truths.
And again, like, Nadine's brilliant on this, but all of these controlled leaks from Gove and Dougie Smith and
James Forsyth.
Yeah, they go to the Times on the whole. So,
the one thing that we really should talk about, and it's something that I've been trying to entrench in the public, doing my best to entrench in the public mind, is the fact that free speech is actually, it's not just this sort of luxury abstract value. It is crucial to security and what we've seen, and to flourishing, and to, because if people like us and others are not free to point out deficiencies and abuses and mistakes being made by people in power, those will get worse. And therefore, freedom is actually an instrumental value that leads to you having a flourishing country and a flourishing polity. What Starmer's trying to do is he's trying to use the backlash of the people against decades of betrayal as a pretext to clamp down on free speech in the name of security. Yeah. When in fact security is best guaranteed by having people free to speak out, whistleblowers free to speak out and draw attention to the primary problems rather than obsessing over the secondary problems. You, Dan, no longer on terrestrial television, no longer within the remit of Ofcom. Do you think that Keir Starmer, obviously this has already been set up with the online safety bill, that we're going to see, in other words, your tormentors join you on social media and on platforms like these, and that Starmer's going to expedite that process off the back of this. And how do we navigate that? How do we reorganize the right if we're being tormented from outside?
It's terrifying. It's actually chilling. And again, it feels like, oh, you're having a conversation with yourself,
Yes.
but actually it's
Yes.
so important
Yes.
because if you cannot trust that the people who you are watching, even in the independent media, are not terrified of losing their livelihood, because remember, the only way that we can do this is as if we are paid to do it. And that's the reason why GB News gave in effectively to the off-communists, because they knew that otherwise they were going to be taken off air and lose advertisers.
Even Albi's gone now. Albi Amankona is somehow even too right-wing for GB News.
I know, arguably the most moderate of conservatives, and I don't agree with Albi, but I always had a lot of respect for him, and actually I was the first person who put him on GB News. And he has now been sacked as well. It's really chilling. And he was sacked because he described Suella Braverman as racist. Now, I totally disagree that Suella Braverman is racist.
Yeah, it's wrong. Yeah.
I completely disagree with that. However, I would argue, and I really like Suella a lot, but come on, she's not suing GB News for that. GB News should have grown some balls and said to Suella, come on, we'll have a debate about it, but actually we're going to stand by one of our commentators who said this. Also, Benjamin Butterworth on my former show used to call people racist all the time.
He did
and
to
you.
me. Yeah, this is why I don't go on the flying anymore.
And he
behind the scenes, we had a bit of a bust-up in the break of where I said, look, I know you're doing it for effect, and I know you're playing the villain. And he went, no, I think you are a vile racist. I'll keep saying it, and I'll ensure you never come on this show again. And that's why I don't do that show anymore. So they're happy to have him there, alienating, frankly, one of their only guests that actually got them views on the clips, and then they kick off one of their hosts for complaining that a sitting politician they could have invited on at any time is racist, which is an incorrect opinion, but it's an opinion.
Exactly. But the thing is, GB News is a controlled outlet now, and it's very sad to see what's happened to it, but you cannot believe on GB News that the presenters are telling you the truth. You just can't, because they're not.
But is the same fate going to befall us? And if it does, what do we do about it?
Yeah, well, I'm terrified about it. I mean, I was looking at the chief executive of Rumble last night, Chris, who was saying everyone should be migrating across to Rumble now. But the problem is, if you want mainstream viewership, if you want to make a difference, the vast majority of Brits are on YouTube, and that's where you make a difference, and it's also where you monetize your content. So there is a real threat to free speech. I'm terrified about what's going to happen. I am heartened by platforms like Rumble and platforms like Substack, where I now host my written work. And I guess my plea to everyone would be support those free speech platforms and support the individuals who you respect on those platforms. I know it's difficult, and obviously I give away a vast majority of my content for free because I understand how tough times are. But if you can support, so for me, I ask people to pay £5 a month, which is about the price of a cup of coffee, isn't it? If you can do that, in London anyway, sadly. If you can do that, you are helping keep our speech free. But look, it's terrifying, moving it away just from us being able to operate. Actually, this is about ordinary people. Absolutely. This is about citizen journalists. This is about I think what's going to happen is the government will put huge pressure on the tech giants with the threat of massive fines, which we know are already there from the online safety bill, but I think it's going to get even more stringent. And what they hope will happen is that the big tech companies themselves will institute censorship. So they get censorship through the back door, but they can still say, well, it's not ours.
Arm's length censorship.
Exactly, and it's disgusting. But, the big challenge for that is going to come from Elon Musk. And thank God Elon Musk bought X. Seriously, thank God. And I know some people complain about aspects of what Elon Musk have done, but the thing is, he didn't need to buy X. He is a hero in my view. He is the world's #1 freedom fighter. I really mean that, because without him, I think all of the big tech companies would fold. The difference is he's moved the Overton window now. There is free speech on X, and it is genuine free speech. You now have the ability to say whatever you want. Obviously, the law,
of course,
comes into play. But look, often that means there is lies, right, on X. That does happen. But I guess if you look at it on the whole, you have to view it as a positive thing. Remembering, by the way, under the former regime at Twitter, there was no platform for Katie Hopkins. There was no platform for Tommy Robinson. There was no platform for Graham Linehan.
The Hunter Biden expose was censored.
Yes.
And the important thing now is, as well, the lies can be counteracted by community notes, as we've seen with the lying communists at Hope Not Hate. Nick Lowell spreading false information that a Muslim woman was acid attacked. Well, people went into the record and said, that's wrong. And we now have Labour MPs coming out and apologising. You wouldn't have got that on prior Twitter.
100%. So, look, I think it's really worrying. I guess I'm trying to provide a small bit of hope because I try and hold on to that hope, which and my hope is that Elon Musk has moved that Overton window, and as a result, America is much, much more focused on free speech. People who were booted off YouTube, like Dan Bongino and Steve Bannon, have absolutely thrived on Rumble.
Yes.
But look, the responsibility is on us here.
Yes.
And I really do say that. If you are watching this, if you're listening to this, and if you're in the UK and you believe in free speech, we have to fight for this. And one of the ways to do that is by making platforms like this as successful as possible. And all I will say is that from having been in the mainstream media for the vast majority of my career, latterly at the Daily Mail and GB News, just trust me, you're not getting free speech from those platforms. The writers and the commentators and the presenters cannot say what they truly think. You are controlled there by billionaires. Now, I wasn't, but look at what happened to me, and that was the point. I always pushed back. I wouldn't do something simply because it's what Paul Marshall or Legarten wanted. And by the way, that isn't me criticising Paul Marshall and Legarten. I think they've done an incredible thing by supporting GB News, and actually they've put their money where their mouth is when it comes to free speech. But that meant that they couldn't control what I said.
Truly testing times. We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately. Dan Wootton, thank you so much for joining us on the programme this week.
So good to be here.
Great. And Connor, thanks as ever. You've been watching the programme. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.